The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. This year, registration for the Numinous School opens June 1st, and there are a limited number of spots available. So if you'd like to get on the wait list, go to my website, carmenspagnola.com. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking once again with John Michael Greer. Why? Because he is not an everyday folk. He is a highly unique, I would describe him as iconoclastic folk. And he just knows a thing or two about a thing or two. Today, we are talking about his book, Monsters, An Investigator's Guide to Magical Beings. Now, if you'd never heard of John Michael Greer, you'd never read any of his other titles, and you just scanned this book on the shelf at your local bookstore, you may be tempted to write it off. But if you've listened to any of my shows with John, you know that he's not taking this lightly, and he is not approaching this like every other kind of woo person out there. So if you're sort of a woo skeptic like me, I think this one's going to be fascinating. I was quite prepared to not really love this book. I thought, okay, this is where John and I kind of diverge. No, I'm really with him in this book. I think the way he's written it is extremely pragmatic and very down to earth, very grounded. And there's not a whiff of woo, really. I mean, I don't know. Listen to this conversation and maybe some of the terminology, some of the stories, might raise your hairs a little bit, but read the book, man. It's very hard to argue with his logic. So without further ado, here's John and I in conversation about monsters. So John, what identities do you lead with?
This time, interesting question. I would say at this point, just now I'm leading with the identity of a student of occultism and the mysteries. And beyond that, I'm obviously a writer and a researcher, somebody who spends a lot of time figuring out how to take strange concepts and put them into words that people can understand. That's my day job, but it's also my avocation, and it's something that works for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I'm so glad you do it because you have such a vast body of work now. And today we're going to focus on your book called Monsters. Now, you said in other places in your writings that the tools of science can't really be used to understand the nature of spiritual matters and vice versa. Or I'm very, very broadly paraphrasing. So what were the challenges of writing a handbook on supernatural phenomena? And then why did you choose to do it nonetheless?
Okay. Well, now I'm going to answer that. I'm going to flip that around and answer the second question first, because the motivation came before the wrestling with the issues that were involved. I was a fan of monster lore when I was still in single-digit ages. I was an expert on werewolf trivia by the age of 10. I was really deeply crazy into monsters. All kinds of monsters. If it was in the movies, it didn't matter. Later on in my teen years, books on unexplained phenomena. I'm thinking specifically here, John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, which was a very, almost a transformative experience when I read that. Just the recognition that the world really is a lot weirder, a lot more complex, and thus a lot richer than the sort of scientific materialist viewpoint would claim. It moved me a great deal, but it also really helped open my mind. And so after I had done several books for Llewellyn, the publishing company that I published with first, that were more or less focused on ceremonial magic specifically, I was thinking, okay, what am I going to do? And the idea of doing a book on that end of unexplained phenomena, that end of the unofficial reality, if you will, the kind of reality that isn't accepted by the official spokespeople of our culture, that jumped up. And I was going, oh, that would be really cool. And so I contacted the acquisitions editor and said, I want to do a book on monsters. And they were really cool about it. They say, yeah, let's do a book on monsters. Then that's, of course, when the rubber hit the road, when I actually had to write the thing. And I had the great advantage at the time I was living in Seattle. I had access to a big university library. I was able to get a lot of folklore material. Just as an example, it's one thing to write about vampires when all you've got are pop culture stereotypes, but there were books in the University of Washington library that discussed vampire lore in Transylvanian culture.
Mm.
What do Transylvanians think vampires are like? Well, I was going, okay, this I need. So that was great. But all the while, I was basically having to deal with the fact that scientific materialism and the set of intellectual tools that it's evolved, powerful those are, only work on replicable phenomena dealing with matter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, matter only to a limited extent. Energy. I mean, I understand they have just fairly recently demonstrated ball lightning in the laboratory. This sounds like a tangent, but ball lightning was something people have been experiencing it for thousands and thousands of years. But scientists were insisting it can't exist. We don't know any phenomenon that will allow it to exist, and we're literally telling anyone who witnessed it, "You're lying." Until they finally succeed. Of course, it started to be videotaped once you got a situation where most people are carrying around phones that can take videos. All of a sudden, there were all these videos, and the scientists were going, and then somebody figured out how to replicate it. So now ball lightning has been tentatively admitted to the category of things that officially exist.
Okay.
Yeah. So matter, the techniques we use to understand the material world are very specific to the material world. When you look at matter, matter stays put, or if it moves in predictable ways. And matter is replicable. It does the same thing. Matter is not that smart. It doesn't have there's intelligence in everything, don't get me wrong, but material objects, unless they have something else and soul in them, the intelligence is very predictable, and it doesn't do a lot. So you can do experiments, and you can count on, you mix two chemicals together, and you're going to get more or less the same result every time. That's less true as you start getting into the subtler realms of being. Once the life force enters the picture, you do the same thing to three different cats. They'll run in three different directions. Okay?
Right.
And as you move further and further toward the spiritual realm, the more unpredictable everything gets, and the more impossible it becomes to use the tools of science.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, that's the trap that scientific materialism falls into. It's like the old joke about the kid, the 3-year-old with a hammer for whom everything looks like a nail. If all you've got are the tools of experimental science, then you're going to insist that matter's the only thing real, because matter's the only thing that you can pound on with your hammer. And so what I found as I began to evolve, partly as I began to evolve a toolkit for working with these accounts, people's experiences with preternatural beings, and partly as I researched other people's work in the same field, because of course there's been a lot of work done on that, is that you have to use a different toolkit. You have to start by taking the witnesses seriously. You have to start by taking folklore and tradition seriously. You have to say, okay, people have been saying this for thousands of years. Maybe there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes a very different kind of study, a study that has a lot more to do with like the study of folklore and like history, where we can't reproduce the Battle of Waterloo, say 15 times to see if it all comes out the same way. All we've got is the evidence that it took place, and so we can draw our conclusions from that. So these are some of the issues that I wrestled with while I was in the process of writing the book Monsters.
Mm-hmm. And this was about 10 years ago, is that right?
Let's see. No, Monsters was the original version of it. Getting on, it's about 18 years. I think it came out in 2001, right around then.
Okay. And of all the books you've written, how has it done in terms of commercial success?
This is still far and away my most successful book.
I love that. I just love that.
Now, the thing is, most of my titles are fairly specialized. Mm-hmm. I think some of them are very good, but if you're not interested in, say, geomantic divination, if you're not interested in ceremonial magic, if you're not interested in druid philosophy, you're probably not going to pick up this book or that book or the other book. Everyone's interested in monsters.
It's so true. Okay.
Everybody's interested in monsters.
And so I think everybody would benefit from having a bit of a baseline understanding then of what you mean when you're saying monsters. So let's begin. How about you explain and describe a bit about each of the subtle bodies? What are those?
Okay, now this is a bit of a cult philosophy, and it's let's start by saying that as with every other human way of thinking about things, it's a mental model. We very easily get caught up in this notion of confusing our mental models with reality. We don't know what's actually out there. We've got these models that we use so that, for example, we talk about a force called gravity. Nobody's ever seen it. We just know its effects, okay? We can calculate it. In the same way, occultists from thousands of years have been working out a set of models to make sense of aspects of human experience that aren't material. And the subtle bodies, that's one of the classic models here. The idea is basically, we all know about our physical body. I hope all of us know about our physical bodies. Okay, so we've got a physical body. It's got organs. It's got skin and bones and muscles and icky stuff of various kinds. And that's our existence on the physical plane. Okay, the occult model is that there's a series of other planes. You can divide them in different ways. The system I prefer uses 5 levels: above, immediately above, metaphorically. These are not like stacked like layers of a wedding cake,
Mm-hmm.
but it helps to think of it as stretched on a line going from the densest level, which is matter, to the subtlest, highest level, which is spirit. So we go to the next subtler body, and the next subtler plane of being, which is the etheric body. That's a word. That's a term for what. Everybody has a word for it. But this is the life force. This is ki. This is prana. This is the force. George Lucas ripped that off from Asian mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
Every language on Earth practically has a word for it, except the languages of the modern industrial Western world. We're dumb about this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the etheric plane, the etheric body, that's our body of life force. It shapes our health. It's our body of vitality. It has direct effects on the physical world. Martial artists use it to shatter, concrete blocks with their bare hands. Acupuncturists use it to, that's what flows through the meridians, and so on and so forth. That's the etheric one. Next level subtler is what's called the astral body, or the body of concrete consciousness. You've heard of astral projection. Everyone's heard of astral projection.
Mm-hmm.
That consists of taking basically most of the astral body outside the physical body and traveling around in it. This is the body that actually mediates consciousness into matter. This is the body that you feel with, that you think with most of the time, that you experience the world through. So that's that. The next level up is what's called the mental body. At this point, we're starting to get at a point into a stage where body is a little bit of a shaky term, because the mental body doesn't really exist in space and time as we know it. It is the body of consciousness itself. The astral body allows us to be conscious of the world. The mental body is consciousness itself. That's when we understand something. You're plodding through some some lesson or something, and all of a sudden, oh, I see what they're getting at. The mental body is just kicked in.
Mm.
You've connected that. That's the part of you that makes connections, that understands. And then there's a spiritual body, which is the essential core of yourself, the part of you that exists eternally. So those are your basic 5 bodies. You've got, there are 5 levels of being: physical, etheric, astral, mental, spiritual. And just as human beings have bodies on all 5 of these levels, all other material things have bodies on all 5 of these levels. And then there are other things that don't have bodies of a material nature, but have some, of the others. And that's where life gets interesting.
Right. And so this is what I love about your book, Monsters, because you spend quite a lot of time connecting the dots between how is it that we can have lore about vampires, werewolves, Sasquatch, chimera, mermaids, fae folk, all of these different sort of non-ordinary beings.
Mm-hmm.
And how are we able to perceive them? So let's focus for a little bit here on the etheric body.
Mm-hmm.
That comes up a lot in terms of how to determine what you're dealing with if you encounter something non-ordinary in this monster category, let's say, and what it could also be mistaken for, and possible I don't know what treatments or responses
Hmm.
if it's becoming problematic, right?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of what's going on in the monstrous realm has to do with etheric phenomena of one kind or another, and in fact, many of the things you can do to protect yourself, should you have to do so, do have to do with the etheric plane.
Okay, so let's kind of back up. You start in the book talking about vampires. It's totally fascinating. We're not going to be able to, explain what every single phenomena is and how to deal with it. People have to buy the book. I fully recommend that they do. But let's begin with this very important moment. And can you describe then what is the second death?
Okay, we've actually laid all the foundations for that, so this is great. Now, the first death is the one we all know about. That's the one where your physical body stops working and you separate from it. Okay, there's your physical body lying on the gurney. You are not in it anymore. What are you in? You're in the other four bodies: the etheric, astral, mental, and spiritual. Now, before you can go on to the afterlife state, you also have to, to finish this transitional process, you have to shed your etheric body. The etheric body doesn't last from life to life. That's part of, its life is tied up with the life of the physical realm. And so the second death is when you drop the etheric body, and then you're just existing at that point in three bodies: astral, mental, and spiritual. And then you go on to the afterlife process, from which in the standard occult teaching, you then reincarnate, develop a new etheric body, develop a new physical body.
Mm.
So the second death is very often where things go hinky in the process of dying. Normally, it's no problem. Dying is like being born. We all do it. We've all done it many times according to cult tradition. But in both cases, things can go wrong in the process of getting born. Things can go wrong in the process of dying, and sometimes that can have consequences.
Right. So, in general, a person who's
Hmm.
having a anticipated or just natural death, in general, most people can make this, transition, and we may have encounters with the etheric body, or you do talk a lot about ghosts and different kinds in the book.
Hmm.
But the monsters seem to, if it's problems with this etheric death, or sorry, this second death, you do say in a few cases it's like there's a shock trauma or something,
Hmm.
some bewilderment seems to happen at
Yeah.
that time. However, with vampires, there was actually, so in this case, there's some very unique lore here that you
Hmm.
looked up about.
Hmm.
Well, there's burial processes, there's ancestor worship. There are these factors that could lead a living person to intentionally want to avoid the second
Yeah.
death. So let's
Oh,
let,
yeah.
let's kind of come into the vampire conversation with you, maybe guiding us through this idea of the etheric revenant.
Okay, great. First of all of our listeners, you can get it out of your system. You can all say "blah" with, the sort of Sesame Street. I'm the Count. I love the Count. We all have that kind of vampire thought in our minds. Okay, acknowledge that, honor that, send it off to bite someone else's neck. Okay, this is not what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, to really understand what's going on here, we have to go back a very, very long ways. This is something that I've been doing further research on, so I'm going to go a little bit beyond what's covered in the book there. Um,
Great.
at a very ancient time, there was a set of processes that were practiced over much of the ancient world, that where certain people, under certain circumstances, would withdraw from the cycle of incarnation for an extended period. There were actually survivals of this practice as late as the early 19th century in Japan. And I think in a few other places as well, we're not really sure. But the idea was basically you would voluntarily, typically an old person, would voluntarily die in a very slow, controlled, meditative fashion. And their body would be mummified. There are certain ways to do it, especially if you slowly starve yourself to death. That makes it very easy. And they would remain as a guardian spirit for an extended period. The body would be placed in, typically back in the day, in one of the old barrows, these earth-sheltered stone masses, very heavily sheltered from certain energies and so on. And they would become the guardian spirit of a community, of a family, possibly even of a nation, as small nations were in those days. So that was That was something that was done. That was a very holy, a very demanding, a very spiritually important practice back in the ancient time, back in these very, very ancient times. We're talking 10,000 years ago.
Hmm.
Now, human beings being human beings, you know as well as I do that what happened was that people started going, ooh, I cannot die. And people got really stupid about that. Because the idea is no, it's not that I'm going to go into this as an active service. I'm going to go into this so that I can keep my personality intact. I don't have to go through the afterlife process. I can stay me, and I'm the guardian spirit. I can tell people what to do. People get stupid that way. So you have the gradual movement from the going into the earth to become a guardian spirit as a sacrificial act, as a holy thing, to this, on the one hand, this kind of reenactment of that without any understanding that was done increasingly with the bodies of kings and nobles and so on. So you go from the long barrows to the round barrows in Britain. You have monuments of misplaced energy like the pyramids of Egypt, which were intended to do kind of the same thing, to keep the personality of the pharaoh intact for an extended period. And eventually you end up in Egypt and many other places, you end up with a situation where society has become totally structured around catering to the dead. And then sooner or later that breaks down and you have what amounts to rebellions of the living against the dead. And you have tombs being destroyed. You have people just stopping doing the sacrifices that provide additional etheric energy to keep things going. It was a messy scene. Out of that, you have the approach, which is very common all over the classical world, of burning, cremation of dead bodies, rather you don't entomb them anymore. You don't put them in a nice earth-sheltered stone cairn where their etheric body can be sheltered from the second death. You burn them so they're gone. They go on to the afterlife. And in a few places, people who where there was enough lore to maintain this, people who wanted to keep on trying to dodge the second death, this process gradually devolved into a set of practices, a set of disciplines you could do in life, with the thought that you would become, you would enter into the state of an etheric revenant. Basically, for the four bodies without the fifth, you have your physical body still in there, underground. You've got to have it in its native soil. This may start sounding. That doesn't mean that you have to carry around a lump of Transylvanian earth wherever you go. The point is you're sheltered by the soil. You're sheltered from the etheric radiations of the sun, which will cause the second death in short order if you're not careful. So you have your preserved body, and then the other four bodies of you can go about your business. Except your business consists of getting as much etheric energy as you can. And the nearest available source is other people. And so you become parasitic. You become a predator. You become a vampire. You don't drink blood, by the way.
Right. That never comes up. This is like Bela Lugosi. This is Hollywood stuff.
Yeah. This is not Bela Lugosi, nor is it what's the twinkly vampire out in the Pacific Northwest. It's none of that stuff. Okay, right. Yeah, we are not talking that sort of stuff. Blah. No, if you read vampire accounts from Transylvania, from the parts of Eastern Europe where vampire lore continued until very late times, or from China, by the way, which has a very rich vampire lore all its own, they don't drink blood. They suck your life force. Okay. Now, it looks very similar. If you've ever seen somebody who's lost a lot of life energy in a hurry, they're pale, they're waxy, they are weak. They look like all the blood's drained out of them. Now, they still got their blood, but they don't have any life force left. And so the confusion is understandable. But so basically what we're talking about is a predatory ghost, a being who has deliberately pursued this hope of prolonging his or her life beyond the grave by preying on other people. That's a vampire. It's nothing romantic. It's not, so many people these days, the media makes vampires into this sexy business, It's not. They're about as sexy as a blood-sucking leech.
So there is a connection, sort of philosophically, between an authentic vampire and a psychic vampire. But we use these terms, as metaphors. But how would you describe the similarities and the differences between the two?
Well, first, the major difference is that a psychic vampire is still alive.
Mhm.
An actual traditional vampire is dead, physically dead. Their body is underground, no longer breathing, heart no longer beats. No vital signs at zero, dead. Okay, a psychic vampire is alive. A psychic vampire, however, for one reason or another, either cannot or does not um, tap into the normal flow of etheric energy that keeps all of us otherwise happy and bouncing and alive, and so drains etheric energy from other people. Um, some people are just wired that way. Other people learn to do it, and I don't. I haven't dealt with a lot of psychic vampires. I've talked to some people. I know several people. Michelle Belanger, who's a very active figure in the occult community, is herself one, and also deals with a range of others. We discuss the matter now and again.
Mhm.
But it's something some people are stuck with, and in that case, you want to, if at all possible, you want to find people who just radiate life force out of every pore, and you can be around them and be happy.
Mm. Mm.
So
So
a psychic vamp, so a psychic vampire can, you can have perfectly consensual psychic vampirism. On the other hand, some psychic vampires are predators.
mm,
Some of them are, they don't care. They're not interested in consent. They just want to drain you. And in
right.
that case, you need to, there are ways to prevent that, and it's a really good idea.
So, okay, so back to what I'm calling the authentic vampire, the actual
What?
dead vampire.
the
Yeah,
actual dead, the actual dead
predatory.
vampire. Yeah, the predatory etheric revenant.
That's right. That's right. So now that we don't use sort of really fortified burial mounds or pyramids, cairns, and very few people, at least in the Western world, have these strong traditions of ancestral worship, feeding the ancestors. So admittedly, this could be rare, but in which modern conditions might some unlucky person come into contact with an actual vampire?
Your chances of doing that at this point in the world today are just incredibly small. The only way that I could think of doing that is if somebody purposely set out to recreate the practices and made arrangements for their body to be buried without being embalmed. Now, this is something the embalming thing. That's the fact that laws in most states of the union require embalming is a very good thing, because when you flood the body with formaldehyde and embalming fluid, all cellular life stops immediately. The etheric bond, the connection between the body and the etheric body, the physical and etheric body, is broken. End of vampire. Um, I suppose you could do an interesting vampire movie where instead of running around with stakes, they're running with big syringes full of embalming fluid.
Right.
But
Yeah, it's a
but
medical
yes,
drama.
but medical drama. but but basically, yes, somebody would have to really go all out to make that thing happen, and then hope they could get enough willing victims,
Right,
and or just the convenient victims, and that nobody knew any of the old tricks, which admittedly most people don't these days.
right.
Um, barring that, I don't know, there might be immigrant communities either from China or from Eastern Europe in the United States that might possibly preserve enough of the lore to make that a possibility.
Mm.
But it's been frankly a couple of centuries since there's been any significant amount of vampirism even reported in the United States.
Right. So it's
So
really being kept alive by Hollywood.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
and so I have to say, Hollywood vampires, put a stake through them, please.
Right. Let's be done. Okay, but let's talk about though, we're relatively speaking then, let's just understand encountering any monster is going to be, relatively rare experience in the average person's life. However, there are monsters such as werewolves that where you don't have to have that intention to be predatory. You could have a lot of different reasons why a person might practice that. So let's talk a little bit about how the etheric body is relevant to werewolf lore, and if at some point you could just talk about why are full moons more conducive for the etheric body of werewolves to take on that animal form and their abilities, by the way. I just kind of
Hmm.
love to have you guide us through
Oh, sure.
the werewolf
Sure.
situation.
Yeah, well, I want to stress werewolves get all the press, but in fact, there are traditions from around the world of people taking on a whole range of animal shapes.
Right.
And all of this is also done in the etheric body. This is actually something Eliphas Levi, who kickstarted the French occult or the Western occult revival back in the 1850s, brilliant Frenchman, one of the first modern writers on magic. He caught on to this right off the bat in his book, The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, which I helped translate a little while ago. He goes through traditional werewolf stories from France. France had a lot of werewolf stories back in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And he notes that very, very often when there's a werewolf running around, look around. You'll find somebody, a perfectly ordinary human being, in what looks like a coma, curled up under a bush somewhere. Okay. The lawn chain. This is again, we're not talking about, just as we were not talking about I'm called the Count because I love to count, or any of this kind of vampire stuff. If your idea of a werewolf is Lon Chaney, you toss him a puppy biscuit and send him away. This is not what we're talking about. Okay.
Or for many
Nobody
people,
is
it
going
would be that other Taylor guy.
whoever
He
that.
was in so in the Twilight thing. They think of werewolves, they
Yeah.
think of some hot young guy.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, the whole idea of you suddenly have the ultimate bad hair day, and so you start sprouting fur from every pore, and you turn into the monster kind of thing. As far as I know, that doesn't happen. As far as I know, it's impossible. That kind of physical transformation. We're in the physical plane, and one thing to keep in mind: material science, standard scientific materialism. When you're dealing with matter, it usually works. It's when you're dealing with the non-material that you have to say, sorry, Mr. Tyson, you need to go talk to someone else. So what happens, what's going on with shapeshifting generally, with werewolves and their equivalents, is another effect of the etheric body. We've all heard of astral projection. Not so many people are familiar with etheric projection. It is possible to take a certain amount of your etheric body, of that body of life force that we all have, and detach it. And under certain circumstances, give it a shape other than yours. It's a lot easier to take on an animal shape than it is a human shape if you have a physical tie, some kind of physical object. One of the classic things in the werewolf days is a belt of wolf skin. Okay, so you have that genetic template, you have that energetic template that enables you to do that. Now, why the full moon? The moon governs the tides of etheric energy on the earth just as it governs the tides of water. When the moon is full and up, there's a lot of etheric energy. When the moon is new, it's very, very weak. So you have that constant monthly rise and fall of etheric energy. Back in my misspent youth, before I broke into print, I used to work in nursing homes for a while. I was a nurse's aide. And we all knew that full moon was when all the patients who had bad Alzheimer's would be really rambunctious. They'd be constantly trying to get up and do things. They'd be really confused. They'd be talking all night. At the new moon, everybody was basically passed out. It was as regular as clockwork. My understanding from people who have worked in mental health facilities, exactly the same way. When the moon is full, people are crazy. When the moon is new, everyone's catatonic.
Right.
That's a function of this. Lunacy, exactly. That's why they called it that. So that basically the full moon, you've got these floods of etheric energy, and so you can tap into that. You can detach this portion of your own energy. You can draw in more etheric energy from the world around you, pouring down from the moon. You can use that template in the wolfskin belt or what have you to make a wolf body of life force, and then you can pop your own consciousness into it. Your physical body stays passed out under a bush or something, and then but you are in a body that is almost physical, because the etheric body, remember, it's right next to the physical realm, and then you go trotting off to howl at the moon if you want to.
Right, and other people could perceive this.
Oh yeah. The thing is, human beings perceive the etheric plane very, very easily. Back in the day. Back in the day, we used to talk about vibes, man. The vibes. The vibes of that party were really cool. I mean, the vibe was really great until this guy came in and it got really heavy. It was Now, there were reasons why a lot of people were unusually perceptive to that. Certain chemicals will do that to you, but everybody has this experience all the time. We all know what it's like to have somebody walk in the room and feel the chill, just go, ugh, or what have you. Alternatively, somebody walks in the room and everyone's looking at them all of a sudden because, whoa, watch out. A lot of that is etheric. A lot of that has to do with that life energy. And so places have it, people have it, we all perceive it all the time. And very often we perceive it through senses that are parallel to our physical senses. When you see a ghost, you're not seeing it with your eyes, which is why very often ghosts don't show up on cameras. They don't reflect physical light, but your etheric vision, you see it, it's there. And similarly with werewolves, people will see it. If you really put work into this thing and get an etheric body of transformation, which is what the technical term here, if you get it's really, really solid, it will attract like dust and small amounts of matter into it. It'll leave footprints.
This is reminding me of the potlatch tradition with the mask dances of the Coast Salish nations around where I live. And I was just talking with my friend Jessie, who's of the Kwakwakwa Nation. And she said, a lot of the anthropologists and settlers, when they hear about the potlatch and the mask dances, they think that it's a metaphor, but it's not. When it's the cannibal dance, everybody in the big house is wearing the red cedar bark around their head for protection because this person who's come back from initiation is the cannibal person of the forest, or is the cannibal bird. And so the idea that we could perceive that, and we could do it even in a communal sense. You're not necessarily all alone. And it's also reminded me, one of the things I love about your book, Monsters, is that you cite so many different cultures and countries and their different versions of this. Can you explain the origin of the term going berserk?
Oh yeah, this is one of the aspects. I'm going to step back a little bit here, because what we have in medieval werewolf lore is again a remnant of something much richer and more complex further back in time. And so the berserk technique. There were actually two different sets of traditions. There were the berserker and the ulfhednar. Okay, this is in Viking times. These are the Norse, the people who live in what's now Scandinavia. We think of Scandinavia as being very peaceful and this kind of stuff. This is the place where the Vikings came from, okay? To loot and kill and rob at all. So one of the things that was part of the religion at that day, and some people got deep into this, was a set of disciplines where they would literally take on this kind of etheric body of transformation, either of a wolf, that's the Ulfhednar, or a bear, the berserker, okay? And a berserker had literally, the word literally means a bear shirt. Okay, they had a shirt of bear hide with the fur on. They would put that thing on. They would do certain disciplines. They would go into trance, and they would project themselves into this a bear body of transformation, which was solid enough to crush people's heads in. They'd do it, and then the thing that you would do, the ones in historical times, certainly what you would typically do is be active in both bodies at once and have both bodies in the same place. So here's your big guy in the hairy shirt, and he builds up the bear body around him, and he's moving in both bodies at once. And this guy's crashing into the enemy. Okay, the enemy is in trouble unless they have some pretty fair juju of their own, which they typically did, of course. So yeah, but the thing is, this kind of stuff, these traditions go back a long ways. They're found all over the world. People taking on different animal forms in trance states, and in many cases manifesting these kinds of paraphysical forms that can actually affect matter. So yeah. Obviously, I don't know. All I know about the traditional dances in the Northwest Coast are, what I was able to read as a white person. Now, the University of Washington had a lot of really good anthropological material in it, and so I did read a certain amount. I also knew some people who were connected with a Coast Salish teacher who was in Seattle at the time when I was living there, and had some kind of nods and hints. And yeah, you can put that in, but beyond that, I figure they've got their mysteries. It's not my business.
Right. Okay, so now there are other kinds of monsters that you cite in your book that are not all necessarily in this particularly scary or demonic camp. You talk about mermaids, however, there's a whole category of fae folk or the world of fairy. And one of the points that you make in the book, and there's a very bittersweet tale of these boys seeing fairy folk on horses leaving, saying,
Hmm.
we can't live here
The
anymore.
fair folk will never again be seen in Scotland. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it made me so sad. So a lot of it seemed to be about habitat, and so in light of habitat depletion impacting the prevalence of fae folk in different parts of the world, do you think that there's any way to bring them back? Like if we restore habitat, is there a way to invite them to return to the land? If you're settled on land that has been rendered spiritually bereft because things have been flattened and all of that, how could a person restore that, and do you think they would come back?
Oh, yes. What you need to do, first of all, you have to remember that when you're dealing, the Fae, whatever they are, and we really don't know, they seem to be an evolution, to use the technical term, that is distinct from ours. They are unquestionably intelligent beings. They do not have physical bodies as we know them. The Reverend Robert Kirk, who was a Scottish clergyman back in the 17th century, actually wrote a very extensive book on them. And the Secret Commonwealth is the title of it. And
It's such a charming, like, I would love if that was a new novel for young kids.
You think so, yeah. But the Secret Commonwealth, it's his, because he was active in Scotland, and he was fairly broad-minded for a Scots clergyman at the time, and he was really interested in the fairy folk, and he became convinced that they were real, and spent a lot of time talking to people who had the second sight and could see them, and talking to people who had family stories and family traditions of dealing with them. And he wrote this very extensive study of how they interact with human beings. Well worth it. It's available in English, in modern English, I should say, English translation. It was written in 17th century Scots dialect, of course, which is a little challenging for most people nowadays. But it's very well worth reading. But yeah, his idea was he was very much interested in making sure we're aware these are intelligent beings. They make their own decisions. You can't say do this and they will do that. Very tricksy. They don't do what we want them to unless they want to. That said, there are several ways where you can interact with beings like this and have a fairly good likelihood of establishing good relations, and that would include, bringing them back to an area which they had temporarily abandoned. Remember, temporarily. As far as our civilization has been on the North American land for a very short time. And I think the way it's going, it's not going to be on the North American land for more than a very short time in the future. We are busy. We are hard at work destroying ourselves in the classic fashion. And so, it's not going to be that many more decades before the highways are abandoned and cars are rusting lumps. And those of us who are still around are going to be living in a much simpler way. That's just, if you know anything about history, civilizations rise and then they go down. So that's over to one side. But if you're looking at, for the time being, for our lifetimes right now, the first thing to do, of course, is habitat restoration, just physical habitat restoration. That's rendered a little more complex now that the climate belts are changing as drastically as they are, because you can't necessarily say, well, what grew here 100 years ago? That habitat belt may be 200 miles north by now. But you basically try to get natural vegetation back. And if there are some, quote, invasive species, unquote, that's normal. Ecologically speaking, that's normal. So don't worry about that too much, as long as it doesn't choke everything else out. But you want to make sure that and it's habitat that's not, oh, I'm going to put in a garden with everything that I want. Take that word "I" and just kind of bracket it for a while. What does the land want? There's a skill that people good gardeners, and especially people who are really in tune with nature, tend to get, of listening to the land and getting a sense of what it wants
Mm.
And if you can learn that and you can listen to that and just try to let it grow in various ways, bring back the vegetation, don't let oh, this week the media is all saying we need this kind of favorable blah blah blah. No, ignore what the media says. Listen to the land, learn what used to grow there, learn what grows the next climate band further
Mm.
south, and
Mhm.
just kind of flow with it. And one of the crucial things is set aside at least a small portion of it where you are going to keep your grubby hands off it. You
Mm.
plant the things, you maybe even put a little border or something or a little fence, and you leave it alone because the
Mhm.
fairies, by all the traditional lore, they're perfectly willing to interact with human beings, but they like their privacy.
Mhm.
So they like areas that do not have the human energy in them. In some Native American traditions, when you went to seek your totem, your tomanowos, the guardian spirit that you had to go to a place where people don't go
Mhm.
because you had to be a place that didn't have that human energy in it. And as usual, they knew exactly what they were doing. So that's what you're looking for. You want to set aside a place that is not going, at least part of that property that's off limits even to you.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
purely for them. Now, if you live in an area where there are traditions about um, fairy folk of various kinds, and that's true of much of America, by the way. The Native Americans had a great deal of lore about creatures that were extremely similar to the fairy of Europe and so on.
The little
If
earth
you
people.
the little Earth people, yes,
Mhm.
and so on. The bibliography of the book gives a book called American Elves, which is about Native American fairy lore.
Okay.
Really good. Um, but so if you can find out what are their preferences.
Mm.
If you're in Europe, let's say there are certain things, hawthorn trees. They adore hawthorn trees. You plant hawthorns there.
Mm.
So especially in the place that you're setting aside for them, if there are plants that they like or things like that, you plant that and then keep your rubbing hands off it. And then it's like trying to attract birds. The birds will show up if they want to show up. You can invite them. You can make conditions really great for them, but they'll show up if they want to show up.
Mhm.
And but typically, they're the birds travel a lot, and they will notice if there's an area that has habitat and shelter and food and water. And similarly, fairies will notice. And
Mm.
so it's in the meantime, by restoring habitat, turning it over to natural vegetation, leaving your grubby hands off it, letting it go through its life cycle, you're going to get pollinators in, you're going to get animals in, you're going to rebuild the soil, you're going to have a space where the natural energies are going to flow more healthily. And whether or not you end up with that specific kind of non-physical showing up to inhabit it, you're going to be producing immense benefits for everybody in the area because that
Mm.
kind of natural the energies that you get from an area of just natural ground left to itself are very healing to humans, to all other living things, to the earth itself.
Mhm. Okay, let's talk about some of the indoor fae folk. If I would like to attract a brownie to my house, how could I make that happen? Not because I want them to, do magical things for me, just because I want that sort of company and and that would just be so lovely. How can I attract a brownie?
He, even in traditional Scotland, when brownies and creatures of that nature were fairly common, you could attract one. They show up when they want to.
Okay. So
You're
all I can
stuck.
do is put
I
out
mean,
the
this
welcome
is all you can do is put up the welcome mat, and if you get there was the old tradition of leaving a little bowl of milk outside the back door. Now
mat.
that may attract neighborhood cats instead, but I'm sure the brownies and cats will get along just fine.
That's
But
right. So,
yeah, all you can do, that's the thing. As it's we tend to fall into the trap in modern Western industrial, especially in America, but in modern Western industrial civilization generally, we tend to fall into the trap of thinking that we can sort of accessorize our lives with whatever we want. And
yeah.
one of the great lessons that we all have to learn in dealing with the wider world, the world in which our civilization is a temporary pipsqueak phenomenon, is that most of the universe doesn't work that way. And There's no reason why it should. You know, if there doesn't happen to be a brownie looking for a home, you're out of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those things. If you may turn out to be one of the lucky ones, but you might not.
Right.
The important thing to do is to act in a respectful way, in a respectful manner, toward all non-harmful non-physicals, and just try to interact with them in a polite and friendly manner, and see what happens. You may not end up with a brownie. You may end up with something else in your back garden.
Mm-hmm.
You have no way of knowing.
It's so true. Well, I will still set my hands to the task of becoming a sanctuary, safe house for brownies on the run from habitat depletion. Now, let's move forward in time to more modern times. There was a very fascinating, very small section of the book, but this captured my imagination as a child who loved Twilight Zone growing up. I remember one of the original episodes with why can't I remember his name? You know, the guy who played Captain Kirk.
Oh yeah.
Will
Come
Shatner.
on, Captain
The
Kirk.
great
Will
Canadian.
Shatner,
That's right.
who couldn't
Not
act
so great.
at all.
Exactly. And not even doesn't sound like a great human, but he was in an early Twilight Zone episode, might have even been the first, where they had the gremlin on the wing. And so you say in the book that the early wooden airplanes that gremlins would sometimes like to inhabit those. And I just was like, okay, let's jam on this just for 2 seconds. We can't possibly know exactly what their motivation was, but do you think they were just curious about flight? Do you think the gremlins were trying to dissuade humans from leaving the bounds of Earth? Like, why do you think gremlins were hanging out in airplanes?
I'm gonna take a step back, which will give us the explanatory the information here, because I think there's something else going on here. I'm quite convinced. It was very traditional back in the days when ships were made of wood for there to be ship spirits, very like gremlins. People saw them. Mariners all knew about them. It was standard. When the wooden ships were replaced with metal, they went away. Old houses made of wood, especially the ones that were made not from the sort of processed, manufactured plywood crap or this kind of stuff, but the ones that were made from large chunks of trees, they very often had house spirits. Those went away when things, and in the same way, the earliest airplanes through the First World War into the 1920s were generally made of wood, made by hand, typically of wood, and they had gremlins. Of course, gremlins, people think of the movie, this kind of stuff. The traditional notion of a gremlin was that it is a little, vaguely humanoid, elf-ish sort of creature that is only found in an airplane, in an old wooden airplane, in a wooden airplane. I think it's a wood spirit.
Oh, okay.
In all these cases, you're taking a piece of a living tree and you're fashioning into this thing, and what the ancient Greeks used to call a dryad, a tree spirit. Okay, you've got that energy in there. Okay, so the dryad's going to take a new form and go, oh wow, this is kind of interesting. I wonder where it's going. Because you see, one of the things most people don't realize is that a tree, when you look at a living tree, the only part of it that's actually physically alive is about a half inch in from the bark. There's this skin of living tree, and everything inside that is dry wood. I mean, there's fluid going up and down and this kind of stuff, but it has no living cells in it. And so, obviously, the tree spirits that everybody speaks of in ancient folklore, they're used to inhabiting wood. And so, yeah, my guess is that basically what you're dealing with here is a wood spirit that's going, well, this is interesting. Ooh, cool, we're flying. But then they replaced the wooden airplanes with with metal girders, and they didn't have any gremlins anymore.
Wow.
I personally think it's
glad
sad.
I asked. I'm so glad I asked, because it just kind of, it goes over, it's like in this larger context in the book. And for some reason, it just jumped out at me, but that explanation makes a lot of sense to me.
It's the only one I was able to come up with, and I only realized what was going on because, again, the University of Washington Library that I was pillaging for information had a great book on this particular tradition of ship spirits in the North, among sailing vessels in the North Sea. And I was going, wow, that sounds like a gremlin. Oh, Oh, I get it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So fascinating. Okay. So I want to take us down now into some of the scary stuff. Okay. Because you have a whole thing on ghosts and the different kinds of ghosts. And it made me reflect on a situation I had with a client. And this is probably, no, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago now. So forgive me that some of the details are a little fuzzy. I can't remember what her answers were. So this is me coming to you for a case consult, as if you were my clinical supervisor, John. Okay. So I actually came in contact with this woman because a friend of mine is a landlord, and he had already changed the locks on this woman's apartment 2 times because of unusual activity. And so at this point, he had the third lock key, but nobody else did aside from her as the resident. And she's a woman in her 60s, widowed, military family. Her
Hmm.
daughters and her former husband, all military. So, very kind of linear thinkers, not a lot of woo woo, that is for sure.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she had a poltergeist.
Hmm.
And so there were so many examples of things being moved,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
very obvious things moving around her apartment, and it was getting annoying. And so she did all the usual things, change the locks, forget giving anybody else a key. And I met with her. She was a very sane person. And
Hmm.
there were other witnesses to these things. She had said her daughters and cousins and that sort of thing. However, in interviewing her, a couple of things stood out to me. So the first fact was at a previous home about 10 or 15 years earlier in her life, and this was when her daughters were, kids and teenagers. They were in an old Victorian home, and for several years, there would be this situation with a music box. And first, they would hear the music and couldn't find it. Over the years, eventually, a music box appeared, and it would sometimes move to the foyer of their home and just turn on at 2 or 3 in the morning. And this, they would put it away, they would lock it, they would do these things. They didn't throw it away. I don't know why. I totally would have, but they just kind of lived with it for years. But they were all skeptical and just strong, stout people. And so then they move and leave the house, and there's no activity. However, so in this new home, this apartment that she'd been in for a few years, the poltergeist starts up. But what was the second interesting thing was she went across country to her daughter's house, and there was poltergeist activity that seemed to follow her there, and objects, from her home put in a new person, just weird stuff. So I went to her house, and I thought, well, you seem to be the common denominator, so let's do a little trance work. And she was already skeptical of that. But what happened was I just got her to relax and close her eyes and kind of connect with some of the energy. And what happened was she started to say, well, I guess I can kind of get a sense of an old lady. And all of a sudden, the big TV she had on the wall turns on, but without any sound. Yeah.
Hmm.
And so her eyes were closed, but the TV turns on and I can see it. And I'm like, whoa, okay. So
Hmm.
that's a yes. We're getting warmer. And so for about 15 minutes, what happened was I would ask her questions, and she would kind of struggle or sometimes throw stuff. I would say, do you think you know this woman? And she'd say no. And the TV was still. And then finally, I re-asked that question. Do you think you know this? She's like, maybe. And it started to change channels, the television. So I realized, oh, every time she gets the answer right, they change a few channels on the TV to flicker to say, yes, that's the right answer. After about 15 minutes of this, of trying to get a sense of, okay, what does this spirit want? Or, is it an acquaintance? Is there something that needs to be dealt with? We got interrupted. Her daughter came in, and the woman was kind of impatient. She's like, well, that didn't work. And I was like, what are you talking about? That was working so well. The TV was turning on and changing channel every time you got it right. We were getting warmer. We were getting hot. But she's like, no, this isn't working. So basically, I would just like to know, what do you make of that? How might you have handled that situation?
Hmm. Well, the first thing, of course, is that it's the woman. The woman has the right to have her own relationship or lack of same with a ghost. It's, I mean, she's asking for help. That's one thing, but it was very clear that it was in some sense very closely connected to her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one thing that I would look for, and this is something that was researched very extensively in the middle years of the 20th century, some poltergeist activity does appear to be spirits. Some poltergeist activity is psychokinesis on the part of a living human being. The classic form of poltergeist activity, you have typically a teenager going through a rough time of puberty. Okay, they've got all kinds of energy. It is fountaining out of and then they're frustrated, they're angry, they're upset. They've got some kind of issue they don't want to deal with, and that expresses itself by flinging plates around the kitchen.
Right, Firestarter, Drew Barrymore, movie from the 80s. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Child starting things. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, but starting fires is very rare in that kind of thing. Typically, it's just things get flung, and it's.
Okay.
If you can imagine, an upset teenager grabbing a plate and flinging it against the wall, I certainly could. It's just if somebody's feeling sufficiently repressed and bent out of shape in one way or another, they can't actually express their feelings outwardly. Sometimes it goes that way. Now, it is possible that one of the things that was going on was that this woman was a strong, untrained natural psychic who had a psychokinetic gift, and there was some kind of emotional conflict that she was venting out in this way. That would be one thing that I'd want to look into. Of course, if that's actually what's going on and she didn't want to deal with the conflict, that would explain why, no, this isn't working.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the alternative thing is that there was some kind of karmic connection with somebody who was not currently in a body, and that the poltergeist was a spirit, and that there were, the two of them had some kind of interaction that had to be worked out. And there you'd want to get you'd want someone who either a really good trance medium or somebody who was who had a very strong clairvoyant gift, the second sight, that kind of thing, who could see what was going on, or a really good diviner might be able to do it too.
Can you clarify the difference? So for folks who have not got a big magical background, what's the difference between a psychic medium, a clairvoyant, and a diviner in this situation?
Okay, sure. Easily done. A trance medium is the classic sort of person who goes into trance. They have a relationship with a spirit they control, is the usual term. They go into trance, the control speaks through them, and then they can give voice to any other spirits in the area. That's been around for a very long time, and it's a well-developed practice. Most spiritualist organizations can put you in touch with such people. A clairvoyant is somebody who has what's called the second sight, who has the ability to see things in the etheric and astral levels. Different people have different kinds of clairvoyance. You might have encountered people who can read auras. That's a variety. And just there are a variety of modes of perception that operate that way and that allow people to see the non-physical realms or hear the non-physical realms or things like that. I have no clairvoyant capacity at all, but I can feel. I did a lot of Chinese martial arts at one point, and one of the things that develops is the capacity to feel energy through your skin.
So like clairsentience.
Like clairsentience, or clairtangency is another term that I've encountered. Yeah. So now a diviner is somebody who uses some formal method of divination, like horary astrology, like geomancy, like the tarot, or things like that. They have some symbolic system that they use as a way to basically ask questions of the unseen and get meaningful answers. So those are three kinds of people, each with their own distinct gift, all of them in the sort of broad general occult field, but different people have different talents.
And so if let's say you or somebody has a poltergeist, and let's say one of the listeners, they have a poltergeist, what could a person can you address that without hiring somebody? Like, would you advise them to or not?
Well, partly I would say figure out how serious the issue is. If they just got a ghost who makes knocking noises or things like that, try to communicate with it, see if there's something that it wants. And very often the classic thing is, the ghost who wants something taken care of or wants a message carried to somebody or something like that. That kind of thing happens all the time. And very often it's just somebody's trying to get your attention from the other side. And if you can give them the attention, you can find out what they want and go from there. Situation solved. They go on to their next existence and all is well. If they're doing things that look like they might get in the direction of harassment or harm, then you probably need to take stronger measures. One very simple trick that actually does a lot of good. This is something that's actually done in Western magic and also in Chinese magic, curiously enough. You take a little saucer and you fill it with vinegar and you leave it in the space that where there's some kind of problem going on. Acid vapors in the atmosphere make it very difficult for etheric force to condense in a way that can move objects. Generally, if you're facing any kind of psychic attack or being harassed by anything from the unseen, that's a useful step to do. Anything more serious than that, you really need to start looking at finding a professional. It's like the difference between you get a cold. Okay, we all know how to deal with a cold. You get something a little more serious. You need somebody who knows what they're doing.
Okay. Well, and in your book, Monsters, you talk about a whole range of these kinds of entities, spirits, ghosts, even angels, and possible approaches that you could take to respond, and then what a person might do if it's beyond that. It's a good manual for that. Now, I would love to know. We've spoken throughout the conversation quite a lot about the etheric field and objects that feed the etheric body, or that could potentially help banish ghosts or things like that that are aspects of the etheric that we might encounter. So can you just maybe list a few of the common objects that would be considered like etherically receptive, and which kinds of common materials could be considered like banishing tools?
Okay. To some extent, it depends on how you're using them, but broadly speaking, anything with a crystalline structure will absorb etheric energy very easily, and that includes like crystals. It includes salt. It includes metals. Especially one of the reasons that in traditional Western occultism, you generally make talismans out of pure metals, is that you can put an etheric charge into them, and it will stick, and it will continue to radiate energies thereafter. That's what a talisman does. You do not. You can now, and the thing is, this can also be used in a way to banish. If you want to absorb something so you can get rid of it, a little bowl of kosher salt. Kosher salt is purer than most kinds, so that's good stuff to use. But a little bowl of salt left someplace to soak up the energy, then you dump it into running water. Water erases etheric energy. The colder, the better. The best possible temperature. This has been worked out, by the way, 39 degrees. If you can get water at 39 degrees, that stuff will suck up an amazing amount of etheric energy and just flow it away. So that's, one thing that is actually advised by certain schools of occultism to try to keep your etheric body clean and sort of free of the crud that builds up is to wash your body in cold water every morning with a washcloth. Yeah, just one of those little things. So water is really good for that. Silk is a barrier. Silk and linen actually are both very effective barriers to etheric energy. That's why when you make a magical talisman, you wrap it in silk, or you wrap it in linen, and so you can, the charge is kind of held in there. It's not going to be contaminated by anything else. And there are, of course, the whole field of aromas and incenses is overwhelmingly important when you're dealing with the etheric level. A lot of the reasons why incense is used in religious rites and magical workings and so on is because when you get those volatile aromatic compounds in the air, that will attune to certain etheric forces, strengthen some, erase others. Frankincense, if you need to purify a space, if you need that sort of high beneficial solar energy, frankincense is great. If you actually want something to manifest, Dittany of Crete, you will have a hard time finding it, but oregano is almost as good. You burn that. It does not smell very good, but it will help things manifest. If you desperately need to erase noxious energies from a place, asafoetida.
Asafoetida.
Now, I
Okay.
asafoetida.
Can you
Asafoetida.
spell
It's
that? Because I
A S.
pronounce.
Yes,
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Asafoetida.
Yeah.
Asafoetida. It's a plant of the onion family. It is used in some kind of Middle East cooking. I have no idea why. It stinks. Oh dear God, it stinks. You burn asafoetida, nothing will stay around. It is the most horribly putrid smell you can imagine, but it is the most effective etheric banisher in incense. And if you have a house or something that is infested with something, you have got to get rid of it. Burn that stuff. Throw in a little sulfur just for a little extra zip, and nothing. You will wipe it totally clean. It's good stuff.
Okay, great. This is good to know. So I've read through several of your writings about, and your books, about your daily protection rituals, your sort of daily half hour in the morning. And I'd love if you could just share what that is, but also, are monsters the reason you have such a strong commitment to the daily protection rituals? Like, do you think everybody needs that? Or do most folks who engage in spiritual magical stuff, are they the ones who need to do daily protection, or does everybody need it?
Well, now, first of all, I'm not everybody, and
Yeah.
it is there's no way that I can lay down a rule for everyone's lives. Everyone's life, different people, different strokes for different folks, the whole nine yards. Your mileage will vary. If you are practicing traditional Western occultism, a daily banishing ritual in most of the traditions, a daily banishing ritual is just part. It's like taking a shower. Okay, you're gonna do it. It's part of the practice. It's part of the training. It's one of the things that enables you to interact with progressively more powerful, more illuminated states of being. You just do it. In the Golden Dawn tradition, where I had my main training, it's the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, and then an exercise called the middle pillar ritual. You do that every single day. That purifies your subtle bodies. It energizes you. It brings you into balance. It's just it's a basic practice. You do that, then you meditate. You do a daily divination. That's kind of the foundation of magical practice. If you are not doing magic, well, there's probably a reason for that. Not everyone is cut out to do ceremonial magic. Not everyone is cut out to do Golden Dawn magic. Different people have different spiritual needs, and for a lot of people, that whole realm of being is still a closed book. In the occult tradition, the idea is that we all work our way up to the human level, and then we spend a whole bunch of lives learning about being human. And that's a long, slow process, because being human is a very complex thing. I'm sure, when we were other kinds of beings, it took just as long to figure that out too. But it's when you've actually basically got being human down and you're ready to start preparing to move on, that you're going to be drawn to spirituality, as distinct from just the local religion.
Okay.
Okay, when you're actually working with your own inner life, you're not just, believing in one or more deities and doing, offering the occasional prayer and going someplace on a Sunday or what have you. Lots of people do that and don't necessarily get anywhere by it, but that's appropriate. They're doing other things with their lives. But when you've reached the point, you've actually learned something. You've actually more or less got the hang of being human, and you're ready to start preparing for the transition to the next level of being. Then you're going to be drawn. You're going to feel that pull toward some kind of spirituality. This may be, a life where you're sampling this and this and this and this and this, and that's cool. Your next life, you may settle on something, or you may just feel really drawn. No, this is the thing. This is the one. You jump into it and go for it. You probably experienced that path in a previous life and are going for it now. And those are the people, basically let the nature of the path you follow decide what practice you're going to do. If the thing that calls to you is, Buddhism, you're going to be spending a lot of time meditating. And that's totally appropriate. And your Buddhist teacher will fill you in on any other practices you need to do to get that into place. If you're doing something else, you're doing something else. If you're doing Golden Dawn magic, well, I've got some books on that.
And you'll be learning how to do the lesser and
The lesser banishing, yeah, exactly. Then you're gonna learn the LBRP, as everyone calls it. You're gonna learn how to do your banishing rituals. You're gonna learn how to do certain other practices. You're gonna spend time meditating. You're going to study a lot of very strange books, and it's gonna take you cool places.
So let's say, a lot of the listeners of the Numinous podcast, let's say they are maybe a daily oracle card puller and a monthly lunar ceremony, and let's say every other week they're doing a bit of a trance journey, this kind of thing. And so do you think daily protection is important to these non-ordinary things, or could you say, okay, I'm going to be doing some pretty intense trance work coming up soon, and I'm going to maybe double down on some protection in this site specific kind of way, or do you think it needs to be ongoing?
Well, again, it depends. It depends on what specific path you're following, what kind of work you're going to be doing, and because there are ways to do protective work that don't have to do with ritual magic. I mean, there are some years back after I'd done a pretty thorough. I've spent about 20 years working on Golden Dawn magic. I decided I need to broaden my horizons a bit, and I studied a range of other magical practices. And one of the things I've studied and practiced for a while was old-fashioned Southern conjure and American folk magic, basically. And there you're doing things with mojo bags, and you're doing things with baths. You have a bath with certain things in it, and you wash yourself with it, and you take a bucket of the water and throw it against a tree, and you do certain other things, and that will, that's their protective ritual. It's not the same thing at all. There are other folk magic traditions where what you're doing for protection is you're putting these little herbal amulets in various places to protect your home or to protect you. Okay.
And garlic, hanging the garlic.
Yeah, exactly.
Around.
Garlic. Garlic is great. This sounds like a joke, but it's not. The one country in Europe that, as far as I can tell, has no vampire lore at all is Italy.
Right.
It sounds like a joke, but there we go. Definitely that garlic pizza is good for you if you have vampire problems.
Okay, so you've been working and you've been researching monsters for a long time. Have you had some encounters that were scary?
I have had the encounters that I've had with monstrous beings on the whole have been spooky rather than scary. And I'll tell you one story, which is one of my particular favorites. This happened back when I was in Seattle again, and I was at that time heavily involved in a lodge called the Independent Order of Oddfellows. And no, I'm not making it up. They still exist.
Oh, we've got them in town here. My friend actually, yeah.
I bet you do. That it's a great organization. They have really cool old rituals, and I had a lot of fun with it. But I was also learning how lodge work goes, because of course there's an equivalent. There are similar rituals in certain branches of magic, and I wanted to get a foundation in basic lodge work before I started dabbling with those. So, but I ended up. It was one of those things. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and most of the other people in the lodge were much older than I was, and I basically ended up running the building for a few years. And so I'd be in the building, and downstairs we'd have, I actually was involved in starting a magical lodge at one point. We were meeting downstairs, and we'd be in there, and I had the keys. I knew what was going on. I had the schedule. I knew that the upstairs was locked and the lights were off and everything. And we'd be downstairs, and all of a sudden you'd hear footsteps. Very definite footsteps moving across the lodge hall above. And the first couple of times, I literally went up to see if there was an intruder. And there was nothing. The place was completely locked and sealed. And then I started paying attention to how the footsteps were moving. And I realized, holy crap, they're going through the Oddfellow ritual up there. There's no one in the room, but somebody is walking through certain ritual actions that are involved in opening an Oddfellows lodge. And I realized that what was going on is some of the old Oddfellows they'd basically given their lives to the order. That was one of the things they did constantly in their lives. They were still in the hall,
Mm.
and they were still of a night going through their old familiar ritual.
Hmm.
And it was kind of nice. The one thing I figured out, if I needed to go into the upstairs hall when they were doing, there's a formal way that you enter if you're entering an open lodge. You have to make a certain sign at the door. You have to make a certain sign, to the presiding officer and so on. And I started doing that whenever I had to go into the upstairs hall at night when nobody else was there. And things got along better after that. They were just going, okay, you're cool. You're cool. Don't worry. Yeah. So yeah, that's my great ghost story. Nobody that I know of. Actually, no. I know one person who did actually see something, but she was a clairvoyant. She was a witch who was involved with one of the groups that met there for a while. And she at one point said, "Wow, there was this old guy," and she described him. And I was going, "Whoa," because the guy in question had passed away from liver cancer about a year previously.
Oh,
and she'd
wow.
seen him. She had never met the guy and described him perfectly.
So you made the distinction. It's like spooky but not scary.
Spooky but not
Still
scary.
kind of in this realm, though, of fear, right? There's kind of a spectrum of fear. So I'm just curious
There-
in general.
There's a cold chill that goes up the
Oh
spine
yeah,
when
I feel it.
you hear those footsteps falling and the room is empty.
Oh yeah. I mean, I feel it as you're talking about it, right? Like it's exciting, but it is also a little unsettling because I can feel all the, like if my hairs were radar, right? They're all kind of standing on it going, mm-hmm. So how have you learned to cope with fear? Like how do you manage that emotion if or when that appears
Mhm.
in you?
Well, the first thing to do is remember that emotions are emotions. They're perceptions. This is actually something. Meditation is really good for this. Okay. Because it's fairly easy when you meditate regularly to get into the state where you feel emotion and it doesn't swallow you. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you think of some time when you've had a strong emotion and it just literally washes over you and swallows you up like a wave and you can't think,
Mm-hmm.
you're just stuck in the emotion. And that could be a really cool thing to let yourself do under certain very pleasant situations.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of if you're afraid, if you're angry, there are emotions where it's not a good idea to be swallowed. And so meditation makes it easy to kind of get a little distance on it and say, oh, I'm experiencing fear. Well, okay. And then go on and do what you're going to do anyway. That takes practice. But just remembering you are not your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Your emotions are things that you perceive. They're
Mm-hmm.
not things that you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you're feeling frightened. Okay. That doesn't mean you have to be afraid. You can just feel the fear
Mm-hmm.
and look at the thing you're afraid of and go, okay, yeah, I'm scared of that. I still need to do X, Y, or Z.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true. You can get really, really angry and then stop and say, no, I'm feeling anger. That's not me. That's the emotion that I'm feeling. I'm still going to keep my mouth shut because there's nothing to be gained by picking a fight in this situation, irritating though that is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a basic skill. Actually, the Kybalion talks about that.
The
If you're
Cavalion?
familiar with the Kybalion, yeah, if you're familiar with, by William Walker Atkinson, aka the Three Initiates, it talks about emotional alchemy, about the ways you can learn to step back a little bit from your emotions and balance them against each other. It's a useful thing to know. It's been part of occult teaching for a very long time, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, in terms of monsters, then, if let's say a listener encounters something non-ordinary and they've moved through the experience of feeling the emotion but moving into action, if there was kind of a back of the napkin recommendation for what they should do in that moment, let's say, they think they see a chimera or they think there's a demon, because it keeps showing up in the woods where they live or something like that, what would kind of be your back of the napkin, like, here's your first aid for that situation?
Okay, the first thing to remember is that the monster may be none of your business. Um, the fact that you see a monster does not mean that you have to do anything about it.
Mhm,
It may just be on its way somewhere else.
mhm,
And in that case, under most circumstances, unless you're dealing with something hostile, something obviously hostile, your best bet is just stay still, pay attention. It's like with a wild animal.
Mm-hmm.
If you were out in the woods in back and all of a sudden you saw a deer,
Mm-hmm.
would you have to do anything about the deer? No, you'd do the sensible thing. You would shut up and stand still and hope that you didn't spook it, because you'd be interested in walk by. Okay, here's this, bizarre creature that looks like the Jersey Devil or something that's walking by. Okay, okay, cool. You're one of the lucky ones. You've actually seen a monster. Pay attention.
Right. Yeah, if you see a
Yay.
chupacabra, exactly.
Yeah, you see a chupacabra. Don't spook the poor thing. Just pay attention to it,
Mm-hmm.
and watch it, and and see how it. If it attempts to attack you, that if there are issues of potential hostility, that's something you don't want a back of the napkin response to. There's material on that in my book, and there is no one response in a situation like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, you have very comprehensive chapters, one on hunting monsters and one on ritual magic to deal with monsters and to protect.
Yeah, if you've got the necessary skills, if you've done suitable magical training, you know what to do. There are things you can do quite readily that will put anything up to and including a demon to send it on its way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, well, there are other options. But yeah, exactly. It's like saying, well, what do you do if you get in a medical emergency? Well, that depends on what kind of emergency.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Right.
lots of
Start, go, Sandy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John, for, first of all, for writing the book. It's such an important reference guide for those
Well,
of
thank you.
us who just, even if you suspect there might be something funny going on in your home, or if things are coming up when you're doing your trance work, you're getting a little deeper into your ritual magic work. There are other inhabitants of these
Mhm.
worlds that we may want to, brush up and get educated on. And I find this a really excellent reference. So,
Well, thank
and
you.
thanks for sharing your stories and expertise today,
Oh,
John.
sure thing. I thank you very much for having me on. I always enjoy it.
Excellent. Hope we'll do it again sometime.
Let's plan on it.
And that is all we have to say about that for today. Aside from the fact that it bears repeating quite explicitly that if you don't understand what the etheric body is, then you will no doubt be quite perplexed if you ever have to deal with a monster. So, number 1, buy the book, Monsters, An Investigator's Guide to Magical Beings. 2, look in my show notes for all the links to the resources that John has mentioned. Once again, super generous with his knowledge and research. And 3, be sure to stock your pantry with vinegar, kosher salt, and asafoetida. Today, I'd like to thank my listeners in Nunavut, Canada's vast Arctic and largest province by territory. Kanuipit, thank you. How delightful to see downloads in Nunavut in the stats. That totally charms me. It's time to reach out to me if you're thinking about coming on Quest this spring. There are always a few people who leave it to the last second. Really, I'd prefer you gave me as much notice as possible. Arrival date is June 19th. So exciting. For all the details and to place your deposit, go to my website, carmenspanyola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.